Hey guys, and welcome to this week's screencast. What we're going to be doing today's session and in the workshop is looking at questionnaire design. And this is particularly important because it's going to link in with your research report, which is the coursework assessment task that you'll be doing for this module. And that's going to be requiring you to design your own questionnaire. It's going to be on a measure of statistical anxiety, but we'll talk more about this in the actual workshop itself. So please make sure that you attend this week's workshop. It's quite important. Let's move on. Okay, so the learning objectives today, again from the screencasts, from the slides, and from your own independent reading. And I've got here a PDF. It's a link to a PDF. So just click anywhere on this. It'll take you online and give you a book chapter specifically on item and questionnaire design. So it's a pretty good read. So what we're going to do today, obviously, is kind of look at and get you to realise the purpose of why psychology seems to be so replete with self-report questionnaires, and then we're going to sort of introduce you to the kind of the kind of wealth of factors and important considerations that go into designing questionnaires. As you'll see, it isn't a case where you just literally dream up an item or a question and then put them together. It's a far more intensive, iterative process than that. We'll also look at what happens when we try and stop people from just ticking any old thing. If we want a measure to make sure that what the participants are answering is truthful and consistent, then there's certain things that we can do to take that into consideration. One of them is called item reversal. So we'll take a closer look at that. And then finally, we'll give you a quick introduction on the lab report in the screencast. But as I say, in the actual workshop, that's where we're going to be tackling it in more detail. So, psychometrics themselves then can measure factors such as personality traits, mental health disorders, opinions, attitudes, intelligence, and so on and so on. There's a wide variety of topics, of phenomena or behaviour that questionnaires lend themselves towards measuring. By psychometric, literally all I mean by that is the ability to measure that mental construct. Obviously, if you think of things like in the real world, so to speak, measuring things like reaction times, or height, width and depth and so on, that lends itself obvious to be able to measure something. Literally, it's a very sort of like tangible kind of corporeal thing that you can measure. But certain kind of behaviours or mental abilities, due to their kind of ephemeral, non-corporeal presence, so to speak, doesn't really lend itself well to measuring it. However, that doesn't stop our ability from doing that. The whole kind of psychometric process enables us to quantify these constructs, these psychological characteristics. And there's a variety of ways in which it can do that. But essentially, all we are doing is assigning values to those different levels. So this way we can quantify and get an approximation of how much, in terms of personality traits, how extroverted a person is. The scores that we can assign to those different values reflect an ordinal level of variable, where we know, say if we give a number from 1 to 5 on how extroverted someone is, we know that someone who rates 5 is obviously more extroverted than someone who rates a 3. Quite how much more extroverted they are, well, that's where things get a bit more difficult. But certainly we know that those scores can be ranked in ascending order from 1 to 5. So Questionnaires are brilliant then to be able us to quantify and measure and get some sort of a hands-on grip to be able to differentiate different levels of whatever behavior or phenomena that we are studying. Now, self-report questionnaires are particularly associated with psychology. Certainly, in some ways, they're kind of synonymous. And obviously, there are far greater different measures that psychologists can use at their disposal, but it's one that is particularly quite common. So questionnaires can be quite useful if we're working with a large number of participants. If we want a kind of standardized way to collect data from hundreds, if not thousands of participants, in the cases of surveys, for instance, then questionnaires are a fantastic way to do this. And because of the kind of standardized format that they have, we know that it should be quite rigorous in terms of obtaining that data, or everyone doing the questionnaire in the same manner. But also it can be used at an individual level as well. So we can find out an awful lot of information about an individual participant. We can really go into some depth in finding out the ins and outs of how someone responds and their thoughts and opinions on a variety of subjects. And so this is typically why we use questionnaires in psychology, because they are so easily accessible, especially with the advent now of online services like SurveyMonkey or Qualtrics. Then everyone, not everyone, but a lot of people are on social media, and therefore these questionnaires can really take off, and you can gather an awful lot of data in a very short space of time. So you can see why it's quite an attractive research tool. However, and I'm at pains to point this out, when we do design a questionnaire, there's a whole variety of issues that need to sort of go into this in terms of the instructions, but also the actual items themselves. And just as an example, obviously you can think of, well, how many items, and by items I just mean questions, how many items should I have on there? But if there's too few, then perhaps what you might fall victim to is simply not being able to differentiate your participants, or not being able to properly measure that construct. If, for instance, I'm interested in how depressed people are, then having one question on depression isn't really gonna, tell me anything really informative. That one question might just, rely on, is your sleep affected? Well, yeah, people who are depressed often complain about their sleep being affected, but that is true of an awful lot of people as well. So necessarily just having a few questions might not be enough to fully capture what we mean by depression, enough to then begin to discriminate and differentiate people according to their levels of depression. It might introduce a certain degree of invariability. So, equally speaking, what you don't want is to have too many items, because then it becomes laborious for participants to complete these questionnaires. I remember when I was a postdoc at Manchester, we used to use something called the Cloninger Temperament and Character Inventory, and this had 240 items on it, and it used to be exhausting for me to sit there and watch people as I used to check in on them now and again to see how they were getting on, going through 240 items, and they were bored to tears afterwards, which introduces another issue, because if your participants aren't paying attention to the questionnaire, then they might not be answering the questions as truthfully and as honestly as they should do. So again, what you don't want is to have too few items, but equally you don't want too many either. You want the kind of Goldilocks zone, somewhere just right, just in the middle. What items should be included? Well, again, if you think about how you might, first of all, define what it is that you're studying. So if it's depression, how might you operationalize that term? Depression itself can affect people in terms of their affect, their emotions, their behaviour, their cognition. So is your questionnaire going to tackle all three of those kind of domains, or are you going to concentrate on a particular type? If it's a particular type, will that then apply to everyone who is depressed, or maybe only a subset? Again, it might depend on the particular interest that you have, or the focus of your research is. What type of response format should be used? This is literally, how do your participants give their answers? How do they respond? And we'll go through a variety of different examples that do exist. Some of which no doubt you're already familiar with. I highly doubt there's any one of you who has yet to answer a questionnaire. How should the items be phrased? So the questions or statements that you actually give to your participants can have a profound impact on how they might answer. Again, it might be possible, for nefarious purposes, to actually set up the questions in such a way as to get the answer that you want. You can sort of gently nudge people, or more likely to get the answer that you want. So again, it's something you need to be aware of and try and refrain from introducing such biases. Equally, participants themselves, if they're faced with a long questionnaire or pages and pages and pages of items to go through, can quite easily get bored and maybe not start paying attention to the questions and just pressing any old button just to get through the end of this. And this is a problem we've noted for our project and dissertation students when they rely on our first year students to take part and answer their online questionnaires. Sometimes you might notice that all the responses have just been like one particular, like the number one all the way throughout, or someone completed a questionnaire in under 30 seconds, which really kind of suggests that they can't possibly have paid that much attention. And equally, what instructions should you give to participants? You'd think, because you have a list of written questions, that it would be rather self-explanatory about what people should do. But you would be surprised at how even slight variations in terms of instructions can precipitate quite different results stemming from that. So always make sure that the instructions that you give to participants, the kind of the blurb that you have before the questions, make sure that is quite consistent, that it's easy to interpret, and it's quite clear and unambiguous. Otherwise, that could introduce kind of unwanted variation in your scores. And we don't really need that or want that. And that then starts to affect how valid our measures are. So, where do questions come from? If you've got to create your own questionnaire measure, where on earth do you start? I'd point out that this can be quite an arduous, painstaking process, but it is iterative. There are several steps that you need to go through and repeat in order to improve your questionnaire. So, first of all, you think about defining your construct. How can you operationalize it so everyone in the research team has agreed that this is how we picture, this is how we define anxiety. Once you've done that, then what you can do is interview people, or set up focus groups, or speak with patients, or service providers if you're interested in a particular clinical condition. Ask them about their difficulties relating to this construct, their anxiety or their depression or whatever the phenomena is. Do some research, maybe observations of people as they're acting out this behaviour. Read up on what prior research has suggested. Can you, again, from the transcripts of all these interviews and observations, can you begin to identify kind of common themes or elements, components that perhaps need to be addressed as part of that questionnaire? Certainly, based on all this information that you're coming into, it's because it's an informed process. You should then be able to start to tentatively create some items. And it's a very rough process to begin with, and so typically you might come up with numerous items, none of which might make it through to the final stage. Certainly what I'm talking about here is kind of the mixed methods approach. So I've just noticed that my face is hiding the link there. We're going to be talking about this kind of mixed methods approach, in the sense that initially we have been talking about using a qualitative approach and then transitioning into a quantitative approach in research. And this is just an example of how a qualitative can inform a quantitative set of research studies. And Laura will talk more about this in week 11. So once you've got these kind of rough and ready items, you can then load it into and create a pilot questionnaire, the first draft. And based on this, you can then give that to participants. You can then begin to, so you can give that to your participants and then conduct a series of reliability and validity analyses just to see whether your questionnaire is accurate, is it consistent in what it's measuring, and if indeed it is measuring what you think it's measuring, which is actually a very important point. Just because you say your questionnaire is measuring depression, how do you know it's actually measuring depression? And that's something we'll come on to in a couple of weeks' time when we have the session on reliability and validity. So once you've done that through once and you've done your analyses, there's things where you might decide that certain questions aren't really making a contribution. Maybe you've got too many questions and some of them necessarily might be redundant. They're not adding or bringing anything new that some of the other questions aren't making a contribution to. So you can cut some of those out and begin to make the number more refined and something more usable. So you can do that, you can streamline, you can maybe even rephrase or cut out entirely and give them back to some more participants and redo some testing. On the basis of that, you can then conduct some more reliability and seem to have jumped ahead an awful lot there. Hang on a second. Let's see where we were. Oof. I'm really not sure what happened there, guys, but give me a second. And so yes, you can go out and collect some more data from different participants, which can then allow you to go back and do some more reliability and validity testing. Again, maybe decide to improve the questionnaire even further, reduce down the number of items, perhaps rephrase, recoin certain ones, and so on, and so on, and so on. You can keep doing that until you get a much more usable, maybe sort of like fourth, fifth draft of your questionnaire, really sort of quite easily. Okay, so in terms of creating the items themselves, obviously there's a whole slew of rules and stuff that you should follow, which makes kind of sense if you think about it, because if you introduce some kind of ambiguity or some potential for asking leading questions, you might obviously influence and bias the responses that you get from your participants. However innocent that might be and kind of unrecognized, it can still happen. And this is why an awful lot of research is done via committee nowadays, via a team of people, rather than just someone working in isolation. It's just to help double check and catch on to things like this. So, for instance, if you were to start a questionnaire or a statement on a questionnaire by saying, isn't it fair to say that so and so? Just those first kind of 5 words there, you're kind of forcing your respondent to agree with you. you're kind of preloading the question there. If they answer against what you're saying, then it would indicate that they are not being fair. No one wants to be thought of as unfair, so they're kind of subtly being pushed into responding in a particular manner. So those type of questions can't appear. Again, you need to be concise and specific. No one wants to sit through, a half-page paragraph of a question. That's going to be way too complex to keep in mind. What you want is something that's going to be very concise, to the point. Again, you need to avoid things like jargon and colloquialisms. Any type of slang or kind of local vernacular can just bring about further confusion, and people maybe not know what you're talking about, or maybe interpret things in a different way from how they're intended. So again, make sure you're keen to avoid that. Also, as tempting as it might be, or as straightforward as you think it might be, try to avoid the use of double-barreled questions. So the response that people give kind of goes for 2 items. So, do you enjoy heavy metal and ballet? Well, maybe there's people who do enjoy both, but how do you respond if you enjoy one but not the other? You can't do, and therefore that's going to introduce a degree of variation in how people respond. Some people might say, well, I don't enjoy both, so technically, I enjoy one but not the other, therefore I'm going to have to respond no to this. Other people will say, yes, I like heavy metal, not so keen on ballet, but I'll respond yes. Instantly, you've got 2 people with the same answer giving different responses. So, make sure that the options and the responses that people can give are mutually exclusive. So similar to above, that there's no kind of conflation between the two. And finally, avoid the use of double and triple negatives and things like that. People know with double negatives, that they are supposed to cancel each other out logically. But then other people argue we tend to know what is meant when a double negative is used, which might not necessarily cancel itself out. So therefore that introduces again more ambiguity. Different people might interpret the question in different ways, and therefore your questionnaire, or that particular question, isn't tying down your participants to answer in a specific manner. You probably find when you begin to analyse the questionnaire that scores for that one question tend to be all over the place, and so it isn't providing a consistent set of responses. There's also the issue here when you're putting together your questionnaire. I've mentioned before of people sort of giving biased responses. So for instance, if someone's tired or at the end of a very, very long research booklet of questions, towards the end, particularly on a computer because it's so easy, you're just going to start tapping the key just to get through there and paying minimal attention to what's actually written on there. And so one of the things that we can do to sort of check if this is actually the case, you could more ask a very, very similar question to one that's happened before, but you phrase it in a different way. And that way, if a person is paying attention, then they will spot this and answer in a consistent manner as they have before. Someone who hasn't spotted it, or who isn't paying attention, someone who is just passing their way through that, won't see that. And therefore, when you look at the analysis afterwards, you will see that those items are all mixed up, or are the person responding in inconsistent, incoherent fashion. And so we can do this by asking a question, both phrasing it in a positive manner and also in a negative manner as well. And just to give an example of this, that's pretty much quite complete through many questionnaires. You'll notice yourself that there is a mixture of positive and negative questions. But there is some research which suggests actually it's better not to do this. And you'll find that if your participants are tired, then the very fact that you are introducing these positive and negatively phrased questions, that is going to precipitate their answering incoherently and inconsistently. So again, just to make you aware that most people would advocate for this, but there's a growing set of people actually who say, no, that's something that you shouldn't do. And again, I've got a link to a paper there by Sonderen, which just kind of suggests that it might not be a good idea to do this. So what do we mean by phrasing something negatively or positively, or kind of alternate way around? If we look at, as an example here, I've got 4 items, just various aspects of personality. And so, do you often feel bored? Well, in this way, we're making participants answer on a yes or no response. Are you quiet around others? Same kind of thing, yes, no. Do you respect authority? Are you outgoing? Let's just say, for argument's sake, that this questionnaire is actually measuring extroversion. And what you might notice then is that the second and the fourth questions actually are really sort of like tapping into the same construct. They're just asking it in a different way. For instance, if someone is genuinely extroverted, are you quiet around others? Well, no, they would answer no to that. And when they get down to the question, are you outgoing? Then yes, they would type yes to this. So what you would find is, if you go back through people's questions, you would find that they need to be answering this in a consistent manner. If they just tap in your yes, 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 yes all the way throughout, then obviously we've got an inconsistent response there, and that can get flagged up. Obviously, if we're phrasing the question differently, then that means that we also have to play around with the scoring for this afterwards, the quantification, how we assign values to this yes and no. If we don't do that, then that's going to cause a problem when we come to adding up the scores later on. And I'll show you that in a minute. In terms of the response scale, then there's a variety of different types of scales that exist out there. We've already come across the yes-no format. And I dare say if you've done questionnaires or surveys, you'll have come across a variety of these other things as well. And it's important to note that each one has its own set of advantages, with that also has some weaknesses as well. And these limitations might be addressed by another form or another type of response scale, which in turn has its own set of limitations, and etc., etc. So we'll kick off with the yes-no format, as we just did a couple of slides ago. So an example of the positively phrased question might be, I love research methods in statistics. And everyone that is passionate about statistics, as I'm sure that there's many of you sat at home now, really enthused about this, would tick yes to that. And obviously, what I can do is give a 1 point score to this if people say yes, or those that tick no can obtain 0. Over the course of all the items that we have in this questionnaire, we can ascertain people's predilection for liking statistics is going to be reflected in a high score. That makes sense. The less that people like statistics, they're going to get a lower score. It's kind of intuitive. It makes sense. However, if we introduce a negatively phrased question, so I hate reading about analyses, obviously we've still got to use the same yes-no format, but that introduces a problem. Someone who loves research methods and statistics is going to say yes to that, and they get 1 point. That same person, if they read I hate reading about analyses, they're more likely to answer no on that one. So what we can't do, we can't stick with the yes being worth a 1. It needs to change. No can't be a 0. That needs to change as well. So if we reverse the kind of the phrasing of the question, we also need to reverse the scoring key as well. If we do that, if yes changes from a 1 to a 0 and no changes from a 0 to a 1, what we'd find is that someone who genuinely is passionate about statistics is going to score 1 on the first question and 1 on the second question. So they would get 2. If we didn't do this, well, actually, someone who doesn't like statistics is going to score 0 and 0. So you can begin to see how we can differentiate people's scores on the basis of how they answer these questionnaires. If we didn't do this reverse scoring, then the person who likes statistics is going to answer, is going to get a 1 and a 0, and the person that doesn't like statistics is going to get a 0 and a 1. So they're both going to score 1. That's really going to sort of confuse matters, and we've no way of differentiating who does or doesn't like statistics. So we need to make sure that we reverse the scoring for the negatively phrased questions. However, one of the problems with yes-no formats is that you're really kind of boxing people in to give a definite response. And, depending on the situation, you might not think that there is a yes or a no. Maybe sometimes it's yes, sometimes it's no, and so being forcibly, to give a question, to give an answer like that, it's really sort of like hard, and it can introduce some kind of distress for participants, or they tend to over elaborate and overthink an item and what their response is going to be. And might end up taking sort of like half an hour for a 20-item questionnaire, really poring over and thinking through the responses. It's always better if participants just go with their kind of gut response whenever they're answering questions. So all we can do then is just enlarge this yes/no, this kind of 2-point response scale, and instead we can adopt something that René Likert developed back in the 1930s, where literally we just extend that yes and no into, for example, a 5-point scale here. So what we have here, let's say we've got a measure of introversion, and so the highest scores that people obtain on this questionnaire indicate that they have higher levels of the trait of introversion. So, question 1, I'm easily embarrassed in social situations. The possible response scale that the participant sees ranges from strongly disagree all the way through to strongly agree. So, you don't show participants this, but what you can do, what we will do when we begin to quantify this, we can assign 5 values here. 1 for strongly disagree, all the way up to 5 for strongly agree. And therefore, if someone who is introverted, are they embarrassed in social situations? Yes. So they get 5, or likely to get 4 or a 5 for this particular item. Now, again, if we wish to introduce a negatively phrased question, so for example, I usually feel uninhibited when around other people. Well, it's likely that someone who is genuinely introverted is going to strongly disagree with that. They don't feel uninhibited. But again, we can't simply use the 1 to 5 scale as it appears there, the scoring, because they're going to get a mix-up of the scores. So again, we need to reverse the scores, so that the strongly disagree needs to become a 5, the strongly agree needs to become a 1. Everything is kind of flipped around. If that doesn't happen, then again we get a mixing up of the scores, and we've no way to separate and differentiate those who have high levels of of introversion, and those who don't. Obviously what you don't want to do is start giving out these response scales with the numbers on there, particularly if they are already reversed. So someone reading number 2 has got strongly disagree, etc., and then 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 underneath that. If you start doing that, people are going to spot the numbers and get confused because they're no longer consistent with what they've had before. And so they might try and answer or think that they've got to answer in a different way in order to then try and go ahead with this scoring key. Again, you're just introducing the possibility here for confusion. So don't do that. Normally, when people give these questionnaires, when they design these questionnaires, you don't see the numbers. You just see the way it's possible to respond. Okay. Obviously, though, if you have a Likert scale, if you use like a 5-point or a 7-point, anything with an odd number, really, it might be possible to have people sitting on the fence and stick with the 3, neither agree nor disagree all the way throughout. And so what some people advocate instead is maybe like a 4-point scale or anything with an even number, and therefore people can't just sit on the fence. They have got to tip one way or another. But why stop at sorry, dog's climbing up here. Why stop at a 7-point scale? Why couldn't you have like a 21-point scale then? Really sort of introduce a wide range of different scoring points. Well, if you think about it, it gets to a point where it just becomes ridiculous. What would be the difference between 17 and 16 on there? It doesn't make much sense to sort of go into that much detail. Again, it might sort of confuse people. People might not want to go all the way up to 20. They might, sort of hover around the mid marks again, and or maybe even lower. And so again, generally speaking, Likert scales tend to be used somewhere between sort of like a 4-point and a 7-point scale. It's not that common to come across anything that deviates from that. An alternative approach is to use something called the semantic differential scales. And this is where you might give a statement, or the participant reads, and then has to respond via a series of antonyms. So you've got a series of words kind of on polarizing sides, and what the person has to do is kind of answer or kind of put a tick on a line somewhere to indicate how they agree with that response. So these kind of antonyms are kind of, as I say, kind of polar opposites of each other. And just as an example, let's say the statement is, I think that exercise is, and then we've got a 7-point differential ranging from good on one side through to bad on the other. And so what the person has to do, in all respects, in much respects like the Likert scale, is simply indicate somewhere on that 7-point scale where they think the answer. Obviously, what is different from Likert scales is that we don't have, as far as the participant's concerned, there's no kind of like qualification or scoring points in there. It's just, intuitively people have their own kind of understanding between those points. And again, we can do this all the way around. Again, we can flip them around so it's not all negative from one side, but it's a combination across all items. And the idea then is that we can, simply using this way, gather another form for accessing people's data. But again, sometimes if we do those type of things, maybe we don't give an opportunity for the person to sort of, give their own kind of preference or an understanding into, how they might view what's happening in a given particular situation. And so one way to capture this maybe is to ask people to provide a ranking of things that are important to them. So for instance, we can see in this example here, we have a variety of different things that might all, tie in with job satisfaction. So there's a variety of options here, such as high salary, having supportive colleagues, holiday entitlement, etc., etc. And what the person, respondents are asked to do is simply indicate, which is of most importance to them, starting from 1 down to 2, 3, 4, and so on and so on. So it seems rather straightforward to do. But again, a drawback with this might be, people haven't really thought, much beyond maybe their top 3 statements or something. So anything beyond that doesn't really sort of have much importance. You might even get people not bothering to go beyond sort of like 3 or 4 and not complete the rest of these items. Well, there might be something on there that that you haven't thought of. Maybe there's something on here. Maybe there's something about work that's really important to some people that doesn't appear on this list, and so they've got nowhere to sort of indicate, what is it that's important to them. And so, quite often what's used with those type of ranking statements is something like this, kind of specific questions where it's possible to follow up on something that's previously been identified or not, as the case might be. So, for instance, which of the following is most important to you? And so you can tick one, or you can even write in here something that is specific to you, something that doesn't kind of correspond with those other things, but something that individual then has the freedom to be able to specify. So again, the problem you typically come across here is people might tick more than one option. Or everyone, a high proportion of people might be ticking other, but what they give kind of pinpoints to a variety of kind of idiosyncratic things that together don't really form like a single unitary construct. Sorry, dog's crawling up. So again, you might end up, what was the most important thing for people? 8 out of 10 people responded other. Where you get down? Stay there. And so, 8 out of 10 people say other is the most important thing. And if you try and break down that other, it kind of, devolves into, 3% of this, 5% of that, 6% of this. And so it doesn't really kind of amount to anything. Nonetheless, it gives people the freedom or the option to do that. So, how then do you score a questionnaire? Once you've, given it to participants and you've got your data, what then do we do? Well, obviously you need to assign the numerical values to responses. Like I said, it could be a simple kind of 1 to 5. And it often makes sense if participants themselves don't see this, therefore they're not trying to interpret things in their own way, but you can do this afterwards. Obviously, if you have used any negatively phrased items, then you need to reverse the scoring for this. And I would always say you should only reverse the scoring once your data is actually in a data set, once it's in Jamovi. If you try and enter the data and reverse it on the fly, that can lead to so many issues that's really hard to sort out after the fact. And so therefore it's much better to get everything in there as it appears. Any reversals can be done with just a few clicks once everything is in there. It's really quite simple. And in fact, I'll show you how to do this in the workshop itself. So obviously then what you need to do is decide, all the questions that appear on your questionnaire, are they all measuring the same overarching construct? Or are they measuring different constructs? For instance, if you think of the hospital anxiety and depression scale, obviously it's measuring 2 separate constructs. Yes, they are related to a degree, but they are measuring 2 separate things. Therefore, maybe we need a set of scores for the anxiety component and a set of scores for the depression component. Now, the scores themselves can take on a variety of forms. Typically, the thing that you'll sort of come across the most is the summed total. And this way, particularly if you're comparing different groups, those differences seem much more apparent, more obvious and intuitive to look at. If you're sort of like drawing graphs and you're doing that, sum totals, you're bound to get a larger difference between your groups. Well, I say bound to, you're more likely to get a difference, and therefore it can appear to be more pronounced. Alternatively, instead of the total score, you can work out what the average score is. So you just calculate the mean score for those questions that appear under anxiety, for instance. And in some ways this might be kind of equally intuitive, because you can then see how these scores reflect to the actual response scale itself. For instance, if you're measuring depression on a 1 to 5 Likert scale, and depressed people score 4.3, non-depressed are scoring 2.6. Again, you can sort of like begin to see how they may have responded to each item, as it were. Obviously, one of the drawbacks is because you're condensing down to like a 5-point scale or whatever it was you used for the questionnaire. If you're looking at kind of group differences, as I've just said then, 4.3 versus, what was it, 2 point something, you're not going to get like huge differences making themselves known, unlike with the total. Well, obviously once they start to look different. What's important to note is that it's the same relationship coming out. The same, pattern or trend is emerging. It doesn't matter whether you summed or whether you used the mean average. The exact same proportion of scores is going to be there. It's just that when you look at it in a graph, it might appear to be more distinct. Or if you're looking at scores in a table, it just appears to be more distinct. A third option is just to kind of convert these to like standardized scores, which is what typically happens with IQ, for instance. That way, you can sort of compare people from across, different ages, for instance. So it kind of, helps compare things. And so you might, in terms of standardized scores, you might be sort of reducing things and talking about, standard deviations, or T-scores, or Z-scores, and things like that. Again, the same relationship comes out here. You've just converted it to a different metric. That's all. That's all you're doing. One thing you can do with questionnaires, obviously, is begin to derive normative values. So if you've tested from a wide base of people from different age groups, from different kind of demographics, it might then be possible to compare an individual person against a group of age, sex related people from his kind of own peer group, so to speak. And so that way, it's easy to then be able to identify how that person is comparing to their peers. So as I said, it might be ages, genders, people from different professions or different socio-economic statuses, and so on and so on. Again, one of the benefits of doing it this way, you can see how people, how their score might compare to the kind of the average of their group. Maybe you can determine, based on how everyone scores, what high or low scores might be. Maybe if we have cut-offs that might signify kind of a clinical cut-off, something that might signify a clinical status, such as depression. As I said there, whether we sort of go from something that's in the normal range to something that may be, for want of a better phrase, abnormal or atypical, something that kind of deviates beyond those scores, which kind of makes sense, as it were. If, let's say, you've designed a questionnaire that measures levels of depression, then you would want people who are clinically depressed to be able to be identified on that questionnaire, because they will be scoring very, very high on that questionnaire. So they might be, for instance, 2 standard deviations away from the average. So that might equate to, say, people who score higher than 40 on this questionnaire might have some clinical significance. So again, it's just an indication about how you can use normative values to spot kind of what could be termed unusual levels of scoring. As I've mentioned beforehand, it is possible, however, undesirable or untoward it could be, it is possible to actually get the results that you want, to nudge people subtly to be able to answer the question that you want. And just to kind of illustrate this process, I've got a silly clip from an old TV program. Basically, this is Yes Minister, I think it was, and it's all about the kind of the politics that was happening at 10 Downing Street. And this is a discussion between one of the kind of the mandarins, so to speak, and Bernard, his kind of assistant, and what the minister was pursuing a particular policy based on results of a survey. And so what he's doing here is suggesting, well, go out and get results that show something different. And so again, just from a comedic point of view, just watch the video and see how subtly it can happen. There's a variety of different kind of social pressures that might come into play, particularly if you've got someone asking the questions rather than someone doing it online. But it is still possible to get those results if you're doing it online regardless. Okay, so to finish off with then, what we're looking at in week 6, in 2 weeks' time, is more about reliability and validity. So you've designed a questionnaire, but how do you know it's any good? How do you know, can it provide a consistent measure or consistent pattern of responses in individuals? If people give different responses according to different times of day, at the weekend or whatever, then it's not really kind of consistent in that. So maybe it's not particularly accurate. How do we even know if we've designed a questionnaire on depression? How do you know it measures depression? Just because you say it does doesn't make it so. So how do we know that? And this is something we're going to start to answer in a couple of weeks when we show you how to do the reliability and validity analyses. And it's these type of analyses, plus some we're going to do in the intervening weeks, that are going to pinpoint what you actually need to do for your research report. So you'll get practice in each of the sessions doing the very analyses that you will write up for your report. Speaking of which, your research report then, what we're going to be doing is designing a questionnaire on statistical anxiety. It's quite a common feature. I'll talk more about this in the workshop itself. But what we're going to do is get you guys to create a new questionnaire measure of this, and we're going to compare it with some other questionnaires as well. And this will help us then identify how reliable and indeed how valid our new measure is. This isn't going to mean anything to you at the moment, but the analyses that you're going to do are going to be based around, first of all, for reliability, we're going to do something called Cronbach's alpha and the average inter-item correlation. So this is just a measure of, are all the items, are all the questions measuring the same thing? It kind of makes sense, really. We'll then move on to validity, and so we'll look at concurrent validity, which, if we say that we're measuring statistics anxiety, then if we give the exact same participants another measure of statistical anxiety, one that already kind of exists, then if they are both measuring the same construct, then surely there should be a high degree of similarity or overlap between scores from those two questionnaires. So that's what we'll do. Equally, we can also measure something called discriminant validity, where if we give a measure of, let's say, something related but distinct to statistical anxiety. I don't know, let's say, we think statistical anxiety is distinct just from kind of general anxiety, or maybe from phobia. Then what we can do is give a measure of that as well. And what you'd probably expect to find, because there is a less overlap between the two, then you would probably find a lower degree of similarity in the pattern of responses. And finally, we're going to look at the beginnings of something called criterion validity. This is where we can compare different groups of people to see, can we distinguish between people who say, yes, they self-report as having statistical anxiety, versus people who say, no, I don't have statistical anxiety. So again, we can just, begin to differentiate, or maybe high, medium, and low. Can we discriminate people who self-report on that? So this is the rudimentary beginnings of where we might get criterion validity from. And that's it. That's all wrapped up. That's going to be the workshop next week.